Good afternoon and welcome to everybody that is joining us. We're going to give it probably another minute or two till everybody gets signed in, but welcome to PEAL's latest webinar. There are some handouts if you want to take a little quick peek at those. We'll get started here in just a couple minutes, but thank you for joining us. So, good afternoon again to everybody that's joined us. This is a webinar from the PEAL Center. I'm Kathleen Haig. I'm a parent advisor in the central part of the state for PEAL, even though we're statewide. And I want to welcome everybody and hope everyone's having a good day. We're going to talk about school having already started, now what? What's next for families in Pennsylvania? There's a lot of guidance coming out. There are a lot of changes still happening. So we just wanted to run through some quick updates about things and answer some burning questions that we've been getting a lot of. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please use the question box to type in whatever the question is. We have somebody monitoring those. There's one poll that we're going to be doing throughout the webinar, and you can, there will be some things that are put up in the chat box, and as you can see, there are some handouts that we are going to refer to as we move along. So let's get started. So hopefully by the end of the presentation, everybody listening will be able to identify some key topics that are addressed in the recent frequently asked questions from the Pennsylvania Department of Education, be able to discuss important components of the COVID annotated IEP. And we will get into that in detail more in the presentation because they've taken the annotated IEP version and made a whole COVID version of it, which is very helpful for families. We're going to discuss supports that should be provided to families during virtual learning. And we're going to talk about some health-related school services. Towards the end of the presentation, we're going to talk about, the different ways to access different kinds of health services. And we're also going to talk about how the Pennsylvania Department of Education guidance is impacting families, what each family probably really needs to know the most. So these are the important reminders that we want everybody to keep in the back of their mind or write them down. Don't forget, nothing in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, that's the federal law that governs special education. Nothing in that law has changed from the beginning of COVID until now. Nothing has changed. So a free and appropriate public education, also known as FAPE, has not been waived. It has never been waived. There's no anticipation that it will be waived at this point in time. So that means timelines have not been waived either. The timelines for evaluations, that if your child is in that where they're suspected of having a disability and may need to be evaluated, they have 60 days after you sign the permission to evaluate to get that evaluation in your hands. And if they're eligible, still 30 days to develop an IEP. The reevaluation timelines have also not changed. Reevaluations still need to be done in a timely manner, hit their dates of every 2 years for a child with an intellectual disability, or every 3 years for a child with another kind of disability. Annual IEP meetings still need to happen, and they need to happen by that date. And IEP meeting requests are still supposed to be honored. It's still perfectly acceptable to have an IEP meeting anytime you ask for one and as often as you ask for one. And these are really difficult times with an ever-changing landscape. So again, we want to remind you, you still have the right to ask for an IEP meeting at any point in time, and the school should be honoring that. And we're going to go into each of these in a little bit more detail here. So the guidance that has come out from the Pennsylvania Department of Education and the Bureau of Special Education, the guidance has been coming out all throughout this COVID timeframe, and they continue to update as things and the situation continues to change. They're updating guidance all along, and sometimes it's changing what they've said in the past, sometimes it's new information. So we want to stress that what we're talking about today is current as of yesterday. So, and as of today, this is the guidance that has been issued so far. So we are anticipating that some more guidance is coming out. We're not sure, possibly in the next few weeks. We don't know if it's going to be, we don't anticipate it to be sweeping changes, but again, as things are moving along here, they're keeping up with what needs to happen and what might need to change. And so we will let you know as those things are released by the Department of Education. And there is a link that we're going to put in the chat box to say, this is the link to the guidance that we're talking about, because it can be a little tricky to find if you're just Googling it. So we're going to go ahead and put the link in the chat box for you. So the next, what we want to talk about now is the frequently asked questions that is in the guidance. And one of the big things, three of the big questions that parents seem to be asking a lot about are IEP meetings, one-to-one support, whether that's a paraprofessional or, some people refer to them as an aide in school that's helping your child, or a personal care assistant, sometimes, referred to as a PCA, that does also help kids, some of them with having mobility issues or toileting issues, things like that. And also a lot of questions surrounding transportation. So let's go in to talk about IEP meetings. Okay, so the IEP meetings, they need to be held at a mutually agreed upon time and place for the school and the family. This needs to be a time and a place, and I'm sure everyone's aware now that most of these are happening virtually, and that's perfectly fine. There's no reason that they can't happen virtually, as long as the parent has access to that and the school or the LEA, as they're called in technical terms, that they agree and everybody has access to connect virtually. And if you need help doing that as a parent, please reach out to the school to get them to help you with that if you need help connecting. And a school must continue to maintain detailed records of all their attempts to contact you as a parent or guardian and the results of those contacts. So, we encourage parents, if you're reaching out to the school, to keep the same kind of record, saying, you know, we really need an IEP meeting. We have some things we need to discuss. And if you've had to reach out multiple times, at least then you have a record that, hey, we've really tried to set this up. But generally, these things should be decided and decisions should be made within a reasonable amount of time, which is generally considered 10 calendar days. So one-to-one support, this has been a very hot topic. Lots and lots of families are talking about this. So if one-to-one support is currently in your child's IEP, the team should review if that support is needed in your home. So if sometimes the one-to-one support is in just for certain classes, and that can make it kind of tricky if you're talking about, well, you know, send support into the home at this hour and then a couple hours later send them back in. You know, that's not terribly feasible. So you can talk about ways to rearrange the schedule. All the health and safety standards have to be followed. You can talk about having contracted providers come in possibly to do this. But if it's already in the IEP, then it's already decided that student needs that level of support. So this is a conversation to have with the school. It's documented need. How do we get the support in home? And they are absolutely allowed to do that. If the one-to-one support was not already in the IEP and you're starting to think during this virtual learning, you know, my child really is not doing well with the virtual learning, they need help, the IEP team should get together and discuss if this support is needed at that level and how that can be provided, because they should be deciding, is it a need, and then how do you meet that need in the virtual environment? Can it be done virtually? There are a lot of ways that schools are trying to provide this one-to-one support with certain pop-up messaging or reminders, and is that working for your student? And if it's not, we need to talk about, you know, face-to-face support. So if the student needs the one-to-one support as a related service at home, again, please remember, safety and hygiene protocols must be in place before that in-home support is provided. And in-home supports cannot be provided for whatever reason. Now, this could be the family has somebody who's immunocompromised and, you know, just saying, you know, we can't risk it, we can't have somebody in. If the team decides, you know, it's not going to work for the student, or it's not for whatever reason going to work out, or it can't be provided, then it should be provided as a compensatory service down the road. And we're going to talk about what compensatory services are in a little bit. But just to summarize here for this slide, because I know it's been a very hot topic, is please don't hesitate to have this conversation with your IEP team. You know, we've gotten a lot of calls about my student won't sit still for this. So how do we, you know, maybe you can get help with a behavior support plan, but if all else comes down to we really need support in the home, don't be afraid to have that conversation with the school. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Cindy, who's going to talk about the compensatory services.
Thanks, Kathleen. COVID Compensatory Services, CCS. Again, another hot topic. So compensatory services are services that are going to be provided to a student to ensure that they're receiving their free, appropriate public education. Now, there have been times since March, since buildings have closed, that students may not have been receiving a free, appropriate public education because of the situation. And that, through no fault of the district or, just because of the situation we're in, they haven't received this, but they're entitled to it. So COVID compensatory services are going to ensure that a child does receive their free appropriate public education when their skill, a certain skill, or there's been a change in their behavior, regression in their behavior, or there's just been a general lack of progress that has resulted. So we do have guidance from this, and that has been issued. I think we might have a handout for you regarding that. But there are, guidance from the Pennsylvania Department of Ed that's going to help us understand this better. So what's going to happen initially is that schools now are in a point where they're providing recoupment services. But of course, these recoupment services, they have to ensure that the child is receiving the free appropriate public education. So that should be happening for your student now. If it's not, or if the virtual platform isn't appropriate for your child, then this is where you want to collect data. As a parent, you're not collecting the kind of data that you might see during an IEP meeting, but you're collecting information to share with the team to let them know that your child's there's been regression in behavior. They aren't remembering, math facts as much as they used to. They're even forgetting some of their math facts, these kind of things. Just make observations. I think this is kind of what, if you go back to the webinars that we had early on, March and April, if you need to revisit those, these are the kind of things we were telling you then. Keep this kind of information. Use a calendar, use a journal. This is still needed to share with your team. So as soon as in-person instruction starts again, now this could be in-person, like face-to-face, or it could be synchronous learning, if it's appropriate for the student. So as soon as in-person instruction begins again, schools are going to resume implementing the pre-COVID IEP. Remember from those webinars we did earlier, the IEPs that we came up with during school closures were supposed to be temporary. So that's what we're looking for now. We are expecting some updated guidance on COVID compensatory services because when this was issued by the Pennsylvania Department of Ed in June, there was anticipation at that time that buildings were going to be open come September, come the beginning of school this year. When that didn't happen, PDE is going to have to go back and revisit the guidance they issued at that time, which may look different than they issued at that time. Next slide. So this is a infographic that the Pennsylvania Department of Ed, Bureau of Special Education Services came up to help not only families, but schools too, better understand COVID compensatory services. I think something important to remember now regarding COVID compensatory services is that the data that the school's collecting is data they've been collecting all along. There's nothing new about the data that they're collecting regarding how our kids are learning. Data that they've collected, up until March of 2020, and data that they collected till the end of school, data they may have collected during if you had extended school year, and data that they've been collecting now since school started again is all going to come into play here, but this is stuff they would have collected anyway. So if we look at this graphic, we look at and see that they're going to compare the data that they started taking the beginning of this school year, which they'll call the baseline data, to information and data that they have from the last school year. And look at data that they've taken in 2 weeks of resuming that in-person instruction. So if your child's not getting in-person instruction yet, or if it's synchronous, which means, at the same time. So if it's synchronous learning, if that's not appropriate for your child, now might not be the time that we're starting to talk about compensatory services, because if the school's not prepared to offer your child appropriate services, then we're not going to start talking about compensatory services, because they have to have that opportunity of about 3 months to catch them up to where they should have been. And if we find at the end of that 3 months through data collection that the child hasn't been able to recoup those skills that they lost, then we're going to start looking at this compensatory services. Okay, so on the next slide, we'll see, this is the second part of that infographic. So now at that time, PDE was saying the determination will be made no later than the end of the 3rd month of school. Now, this is one of those sections where it may be changing just because we didn't anticipate that there may still be hybrid instruction or at-home synchronous instruction. So what the team's going to look at, now team, parents, that includes you as an equal partner. Did the student regain lost skills or regarding behavior and make progress on IEP goals? If the answer is no, then we're going to take a look at what kind of COVID compensatory services, they're calling it CCS just because it's easier, will the student be eligible for? And we're going to discuss this as an IEP team. At that point, then, the school part of the team will document what they're going to offer a student regarding CCS. Now, don't forget that I in IEP still stands for individualized. So if you feel what's being offered isn't individualized or that it's not appropriate for your child, that's something you want to bring up at the IEP meeting. Now, if we find that a student was able to recoup their skills, was able to make progress, then we're just going to continue with the instruction as it is in the IEP, and the school team, as they have in the past, will maintain communication with families. Now, extended school year, this is different from compensatory services. Keep these two things separate in your minds because they're not the same thing. Compensatory services, because we're looking at really long-term catching up and providing those services, might not, in fact, be happening until next summer. That's a possibility of when it could be provided. So extended school year isn't going to be offered in place of CCS. This is something that's totally separate. So keep that in mind. If you have questions, Appeal Center is always here for you. So don't hesitate in calling and working through this till you understand it. So again, like Kathleen mentioned in the beginning, a lot of things haven't changed. So the process for determining extended school year eligibility has not changed. We're going to look at data during long breaks taken before and after and see what that means as far as a student losing skills and then regaining their skills. Or, there are 7 criteria for extended school year, so we're gonna look at those other criteria also. So data collected is going to include data prior to the school's closure and data collected during the mandatory times when school was closed to the end of last year. We're going to look at all of that. So some students may be eligible for extended school year that haven't been before because of skills that they lost. So after the winter break, when we typically, if we're going to take data regarding extended school year, it's going to happen during that long winter break. Before, the school is going to collect data regarding where the student is, regarding their the goals in the IEP that have been identified as ESY goals, and then collecting that same data afterwards and comparing it to how much was lost and how long it took the student to regain that. Evaluation and reevaluations, again, and I don't think we can tell you this too many times, timelines have not been waived and cannot be reset. So if the school started an evaluation, it shouldn't be necessary for them, unless this was during this, the summer break when they aren't doing evaluations, shouldn't be necessary to say, oh, we've got to stop now. That wasn't in play even last March when buildings closed. It's important to know that child find, which is an essential part of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That's part of the law that says that the school must locate, identify, and evaluate a student to find out if they're eligible for special education. This is not waived. If you suspect that your child needs special education and make that request for an evaluation, there's no reason to extend or to deny that evaluation because of COVID or because things are different now. It is not waived. So while some parts of the evaluation can be done, other parts of the evaluation may require in-person testing. Some standardized tests can only be done in person, and that those still have to happen face-to-face. Some parts of an evaluation can be done remotely. We look at a particular test like a behavior assessment where a parent, a school teacher, and possibly the student fill out these questionnaires. Now, something like that can be done remotely, sent back in. But those ones where it has to happen face-to-face doesn't mean that we have to delay eligibility or reevaluation. What it means is we're going to take the data that we have, the information that we have on the student, and use that to make some determination of eligibility. When it's possible, again, for the school to be able to give that standardized testing in person, we'll do that at that point. But there's no reason at this time to delay or to extend an evaluation that's going to come up with eligibility determinations. Okay, next. Okay, what you've been waiting for, right? The COVID annotated IEP. Now we do have a link for this. Annotated IEPs for the Appeals Center has always been a great document to have, a great one that we give out to families all the time, just to take along to your IEP meetings so that if the team gets stuck on what should be in this part, we can just open up our annotated IEP, annotated being with notes, and the whole team can be on the same page regarding what's supposed to be in that part of the IEP. So because of COVID, we've had to have some additional guidance. So the annotated IEP has been updated and highlighted. It's really easy to read because PDE did highlight the new parts that have been added regarding COVID. So under the special considerations part of the annotated IEP, there might be a discussion about telehealth or in-person regarding communication needs. Are there barriers to learning when personal protective equipment might be being used, depending on the child? Some things to consider: does the child require closed captioning to participate in remote learning? Regarding behavior, this is really something teams should discuss regarding remote or hybrid learning and how that's impacting the student. In the goals and objectives part of the IEP, we want to consider changes or adjustments in the measurable components of the IEP due to the hybrid learning or the asynchronous learning. Anything that is changed should be part of the IEP team decision, meaning that the parent, again, as an equal partner, be part of that change. They have to agree. But at no time, again, are we waiving the students' right to a free, appropriate public education. If you remember what's in that pre-COVID IEP, that was free, appropriate public education. You agreed to that as free, appropriate public education for your child, and that's what we're still looking at as far as being appropriate for the child. Progress monitoring. Schools should still be taking data on the students' IEP goals and reporting that data to you quarterly, reporting that data to a parent quarterly, or as often as report cards are issued. That's the way it's worded. So let's take a look at that. It shouldn't be on the parent to be collecting data. Now, like we said early on and at those previous webinars, it is important for you as a parent being home with the child, if that's the kind of learning we're having now, to provide information to the school about what's going on at home, where you feel the child's not making progress, where he's really, having difficulty. That kind of data we need, but progress monitoring is very specific to the goals that are in the IEP. This is on the school, so the teacher, special education teacher, gen ed teacher, paraprofessional, to collect data on these goals. The IEP team also wants to consider functional performance. So this is important where the primary caregiver, so whether that's someone that's watching the child during the day or the parent, you're going to provide that information to the school because you might be seeing things they're not seeing. And it's important that you share that with your IEP team. Educational placement should not be changed during this time. It's still expected that a child's placement is going to be where the IEP team decided it was going to be pre-COVID. So we want to make sure that the child's getting everything they need as far as recoupment strategies, as far as specially designed instruction, and maybe, the COVID compensatory services, and looking at that before we make any kind of changes to educational placement. A child is still entitled to their least restrictive environment. And we want to make sure that the team is keeping the time inside the regular education classroom, regardless of how the student is learning. So whether it's remote or hybrid learning, any change that's different from what's in the IEP would have to be an IEP team decision. And if there's educational placement change, we would also need to have NORAP issued. Supplementary aids and services. Now, this might be a place where the teams had to make some tweaks as far as what's being provided to the student. Like Kathleen said, we want to talk about one-on-one. Is that needed as it was needed in the school, or is it a need now that the child is learning from home? The IEP team needs to take a look at what the regular class instruction during remote or hybrid learning looks like, and what the student will need then in these situations to be successful in school. If a regular education teacher held an online class 3 times a week for 30 minutes, the IEP team is going to think about, could the student participate in the class with or without supplementary aids and services? So that's what we're going to think about regarding supplementary aids and services. Whatever changes are needed, bring that to your team. Kathleen?
Thank you, Cindy. a wealth of information there. What we want to talk about next is supports for families. I'm sure you would love to bring a team of people into the house to help out. And barring that, what we want to say here is the school should be offering some training. So parent training is an important piece of what you can expect from the school. So we would encourage you to contact the IEP team, contact, the school and say, hey, we're having trouble even accessing the technology. Like you say, a lot of rural areas don't even have internet. They can give you a hotspot. If that's not working or you don't know how to use it, the school should be providing training on how that works and how you can access it. All the Chromebooks, the tablets, all the different kinds. If you or your student, especially you as a parent, helping your student at home, if you aren't sure how to use all the buttons and gadgets and gizmos and apps and everything, the programs, platforms, you really need to ask the school for help. You can do it, possibly in person, go into the school and they can walk you through it. They might just be able to help you with a couple little things online, do a Zoom meeting, do a phone call, let's go old fashioned, let's do a phone call. All of the assistive technology that's available right now to students just boggles the mind. It really does. And because that may be so helpful to some students right now, we would encourage you to talk to the school and say, hey, this seems like a great thing to work for my child, but I need to help them with this. I need to learn how to do it because I'm here with them during the day. Can you give me some training on how this works so I can help them? And it's not that the school isn't going to be training your student on this, but we all know, when a question comes up, they're going to turn to mom or dad usually, or the caregiver, and say, hey, I need a little help here. Down to, like I was talking about, internet connectivity. If your child is on Wi-Fi and they keep getting bumped off, that's a problem. That interferes with their access to learning. They need to be able to have that continuous stream from virtual learning. And if that is a problem, you need to talk to the school about it. There are ways to solve these problems, and it is up to the school to help you work through that. It should be a team approach, but just know as a parent, you can request training in these areas. Even for all this remote learning, if there is something in particular that the student needs to do and they're having trouble with it, you can ask for help in order to help your child. These accommodations and modifications that are listed in their IEP sometimes will look differently as they are delivered in the virtual environment. And it's okay to go to them and say, hey, what's this going to look like virtually? And do we maybe need to change this accommodation or modification so it works in the virtual environment? What does that look like? Give me all the options and describe what how it would work so we can decide, be an informed decision maker on how this is going to work best for my child. Behavior support strategies, so important right now. So many people are talking about this, that the behaviors that they're seeing during the virtual learning weren't even happening in school, but they're happening because of so much change going on, or for whatever reason. Then have a conversation with the team about how can we help the kids behaviorally? What kind of visual checklists can I maybe use? What kind of reward system can I use? There's all kinds of things that could be implemented. And, the behavior specialists at the school really can come up with some pretty amazing virtual help sometimes, and you'd be really surprised, but you won't know until you ask. So again, we're just gonna encourage you to have those meetings. The specially designed instruction that happens online versus in the classroom can look differently if they need to, say, modify a test. if the test's being taken online, that modification may look a little different, and it's important for parents to understand that. There are also things like Schoolology and Class Dojo and Google Classrooms, and if you're confused about how to use any of these, which helps you communicate with the teacher or go on to look at what your students' grades are, what assignments might be missing, how do they even log into the classroom. Any of this is fair game to go to the school and say, hey, I really need some training on this. I need to figure out how to do it so I can help my student. And it's not to say, hey, your student might be able to help you. So lots of times they're better at the technology than we are. So just a big reminder that parent training is absolutely something that you can ask for and should be receiving. The next thing that we have is a poll. So the poll instructions are here. You can text 22333 and then put in Janine, BRIN 240. And then once you've joined that text message, you'll be able to then stay in that message. In that text box, you'll be able, on the next slide, you'll see what the questions are and be able to give us your answer, or you can go to the website, www.pollev.com/Janine, BRIN 240. You go to that website, you'll also be able to answer the question. And we're going to put that information in the chat box for what's coming, the poll coming on the next slide. So what we want to know from you, what's really important for us to really get a sense of how schools are doing, is how they're providing the related services. Wow, 100% are all virtual. That's pretty astounding.
That's just one person responding, I think. It'll change.
Oh,
It'll change.
There it goes. How are they providing your related services? This is coming from a lot of schools doing the hybrid model, probably, where they're going a couple days to school and they're going a couple days in home. A lot of them are still trying to do it all virtually. We're going to talk about these related services on the next slide. All in person. That's great. Some schools have been able to go back to, all in-person learning, but I think mostly what we're hearing about are the hybrid models, or the kids with IEPs are going back to school full-time in person.
Just let me know when you want to move on, Kathleen.
Okay. If you think most of the responders are done, that's really interesting, because it seems to be a big mix of either all virtual or virtual and in person. So that's very interesting. Thanks everybody for doing that poll. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about these related services, like speech, occupational therapy, counseling, paraprofessional help. None of you, or I'm going to say most of you, are not certified speech pathologists. So you may feel like you have become one over these last several months, but if in a virtual related service is not working for your child, and we see this more in terms of occupational therapy or physical therapy, if it's just not working, you've given it a try, we ask that, give it a try. They can get very creative and trying to engage the student and getting them to do what they need to do. But if you've documented that it is just not working for your child, please call an IEP meeting, request an IEP meeting, and then talk about the documentation that you have saying it is just not working in this virtual mode, and this is why. Either the student is unable to follow the directions that the related service provider is giving. The attention isn't there. You don't feel that it's safe, whatever the reason is. And the document, we tried, it's not working. Try to change the virtual related service to in-person. And the ways that you can do that are through contracted providers, perhaps. Schools often contract with these speech and occupational therapists from other agencies, and those other agencies are fine with going into the home under following all the safety and health precautions. So also, you might be able to take your child into the school during a specified period of time and have those related services delivered then for that short period of time in the school. You can also maybe have them delivered somewhere in the community, say at a library or at a YMCA, places like that where communities are able to, people in the community are still able to meet up. Or they can come right into the home and do it. If that's something you feel safe doing, and the service providers are also okay with it, and everybody is following the safety procedures, that is something that you can ask for. And we want to mention here that there is updated OSEP guidance, and that's the Office of Special Education Programs. And that is the federal level. This is the federal Office of Special Education, and they have put out their own guidance, and it aligns right with the Pennsylvania guidance is saying, so there's no discrepancy. It does, support what Pennsylvania has been saying about everything. And sometimes, these frequently asked questions, this guidance, maybe you'll just understand it better than the way Pennsylvania wrote it, but it's all very much the same. But it's good to know, the federal government, the state government, everybody's in agreement, FAPE has not been waived, etc. So that link is in the chat box as well, because again, these guidances can be difficult to find sometimes when you're just trying to Google them. So we put the link in the chat box. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kelly King, who's going to talk about the important health-related school services.
Hi, so I just want to say hello to you. I'm Kelly King. My job at the Peel Center is to deal with all things health. And I live in one of those rural counties that Kathleen just mentioned. I see I just froze. So I have already had a couple of problems with keeping on tune on the webinar. So I'm going to turn my camera off so I can hopefully continue to be connected, and to hear me is going to be more important than to see me. There we go. So today I want to talk about some of the health-related services that a student might receive remotely as a part of those school services. And I'm going to throw another name at you here. How about tele-related services? This has just been an unusual time. The COVID virus has changed our experiences with a lot of things, and healthcare in particular, as well as education. So some of these new terms that describe remote health services can boggle the mind. And in fact, it's hard enough to know what these things are, let alone how they do and how they should work. So let's talk about some of those. We all know, next slide please, that there are health-related services that a student might receive from anybody at school. So there are nurses, counselors, of course, the psychologists, and frequently schools have social workers. Those staff can provide services regularly to any number of students in their buildings. And additionally, some of the students who have disabilities receive related services, which Kathleen already mentioned, and those are designed to meet the individual needs of the student. You're likely familiar with speech, like she just mentioned, and perhaps audiology services, as well as the OT, occupational, PT, physical, and vision therapies. Psychological services and counseling can also be provided through a student's related services. And then there are some students who have visual impairments that receive orientation and mobility. And the O&M helps those students to orient to and safely move about within environments. And that includes teaching students the skills they need to navigate in their world. Other students get, as I said, social work services, and some have school health and or school nursing services. And those all can be provided as related services. That's not an exhaustive list, but those again are provided to meet whatever the student's unique needs are. And their social emotional skills, behavioral training, and mental health support could also be provided. And those could all be done remotely. But as Kathleen suggested, some of those could be more challenging than others. And sometimes our students aren't real inclined or interested in doing it in a telehealth format remotely. And so that's certainly a concern. If those services are provided through your student's IEP or perhaps their 504 plan, your school or your particular student perhaps and they are learning in an online format, there are some ways, as I suggested, that they can be provided in remote ways. Next slide, please. So, what should you expect if your child is getting a teleservice? Well, it's going to be important that that quality not be sacrificed. It should be the same, equal to what they were getting in the face-to-face environment. And the services need to be done in a way that's consistent with the IEP. So if it says they're in a small group or one-on-one or whatever it is, or so much time per week, that should still be being done. Those activities that are in there should be designed to help your child move toward meeting the IEP or their 504 goals. And I need you to be aware that there are licensing boards for a lot of therapists and counselors and psychologists. So they do have to be careful that they're adhering to their licensing guidelines. And that might impact the requirements about the teleservices that they're delivering to your child. So if they tell you something like that, just recognize that that's true. Maybe an outside provider will have to be contracted if there's a problem with that licensed provider with their particular board delivering the service in that way. Understand, so there are some distinctions. So a psychologist can have a board certification through the Department of Education, or they could have that through the Department of Health. So there are differences in their licensure that might impact how they're able to work with your student. And as I suggested, Kathleen has already tackled some problems if this isn't working for you. And like she said, I fully agree. If there's a problem with the service, whatever it is about it, when it's delivered, how it's delivered, your child just does not learn this way, or whatever the problem is, it's always a great idea to first address it with that provider. And if that doesn't resolve the issue, if you can't find a solution, if necessary, go to administration or pull your IEP team together and have them brainstorm ways to resolve this situation. Next slide. So there are some potential problems that people are concerned about. Number one is a question comes up often that, is this a FERPA violation to, have people online together perhaps and have small groups meeting for speech and language pathology? Well, FERPA really has to do with personally identifying information, identifiable information, and student records. So if the service is delivered remotely in your home and your small group of kids who your child sees in the building are gathering together, there shouldn't be any problem with FERPA. You're not releasing, the student's name and address. And then HIPAA, due to the COVID pandemic, a public health emergency, there has been some flexibility with HIPAA regulations when you think about various types of meetings, the Zoom meetings where, people get in there who aren't supposed to be there. So they have allowed a lot more platforms that have not been HIPAA compliant and are not HIPAA compliant to be used now because of the public health emergency. So recognize that and just do your very best to keep information confidential, to keep private issues private, and to, you know, give your child privacy and a quiet space to work with the provider and perhaps other students are working with. Next page. So there are actually more than 15% of students who get mental health services each year, and half of those are not addressed. This is just in general. And of the students who do get mental health support, many of them get those services at school. I've given you a lot of resources here. You know, mental, social, and emotional health and learning should be priorities for schools as they get students involved again. So many of them just want to be there to be with their friends, and that's fabulous. Unfortunately, you know, sometimes when they get back in the building, they don't get to intersect with their friends in ways they did in the past anyhow, so that's devastating. But, you know, it has been recognized that following COVID, support for mental health and well-being are really huge. And of course, as Kathleen already alluded to, there have been lots of behavioral concerns with some students in this remote learning environment. So there are schools that partner with telehealth providers, behavioral health, and community organizations to deliver services to students. So if you had an outside provider, you want to reach out to them, use them as resources too, see how that's going to work, brainstorm with them, you know, what's their plan for engaging with the students and getting back into the building or providing telehealth. And then just lastly, the school nurses sometimes drop by teachers' remote classrooms to connect with students and to collaborate with teachers. Recognize that school nurses have a lot of jobs to do and juggle through the day. They have to not only manage the health plans of students who have healthcare conditions, but they are having virtual office hours. So if your student needs to see the nurse, don't hesitate to reach out to them, find out what their hours are. And then many of our school nurses helped during the pandemic with delivering meals remotely and working on the pandemic plan that the school had to create. And they're busy educating students and staff about COVID and the COVID protocols we need to follow, in addition to seeing that everybody's immunizations are up to date. So again, take advantage of all those resources, both in the school, and then take a look at some of these that I've provided for you, which have some ideas for you to perhaps do at home, and many of them are free, which is always a great thing for us. So I thank you for your time. If you have any other questions with regard to telehealth or medical issues with telehealth, some of the earlier webinars that we did were really informative to help with troubleshooting some of those and understanding what that is. So don't hesitate to take a look at our website and go back and look at those. Cindy, back to you.
Thanks, Kelly. Wow. That was a lot of information. So part of why we do this is to give you that information, and then, yeah, naturally it's going to create a lot of questions, but that's why we're here, to answer those questions for you. We were able to keep that to an hour, so that's fantastic. A lot of questions did come in through the question box, so we'll get to all of those. And then if you have any questions for us, our offices, while the offices themselves are closed, we're all available. So here's our contact information. Please reach out if there's anything you need, any questions about what we talked about today. If you read over the information that you've gotten from the handouts, call and ask us, anything that you need to know. Really appreciate everybody showing up, and have a great day.
Thanks, Cindy. I just wanted to mention also the recording of the webinar and all the handouts will be posted on the Peel website, which you can see on this page. They'll be up probably by tomorrow. So if you had any difficulty accessing the handouts via GoToWebinar, you'll be able to go to our website and access them as well.